Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. My name is Serena, and in today's video we're going to be going over different seam finishes that I use in my garments. These seam finishes can be done with or without a serger. So without further ado, let's get into this video. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next one. Thank you. The first method we're going to talk about is the serge edge. It requires a serger and it wraps the raw edge with thread. This finish can be similarly achieved with a sewing machine that has a cover stitch function. The next stitch we're going to talk about is the French seam. French seam conceals the raw edges by sewing it inside of itself. It's perfect for sheer fabrics because the seam looks nice both on the inside and the outside, and it's a very durable finish. First, you want to sew a 3/8 seam allowance with the wrong sides touching each other. And then you're going to press that open and cut the seam allowance down. Then you're going to flip it right sides together and sew it in 1/4 inch. And this is if your pattern requires a 5/8 seam allowance. The French seam is my favorite seam finish. I do this on pretty much everything that I can. I do avoid bulky fabrics when it comes to this. I also do avoid some areas that will usually create some form of bulk, depending, like a gathered waist or like a puff sleeve or anything that would add additional fabric and create some sort of a bulk. I will do a serged edge instead, or a seam binding finish for a waist. And this is what the finished look is like. This is the inside and that is the outside. And it does take a little bit more time, but it's worth it. The next way to finish a seam is to do a pinked edge. This is a vintage way of doing it. A lot of pattern instructions will show you this method, and it just requires pinking shears for you to cut down the seam allowance. The serrated edges keeps the fabric from fraying any further. I use this method the least. I mainly cut my seam allowance with pinking shears when I am cutting around curved edges. So the final seam finish that I do is a seam binding, and this seam binding is on one of the first dresses that I've ever made. So it's kind of not the cleanest work, but this was definitely one of my first. I didn't have a serger at the time, so there's some fray check on here. But with the seam binding, you'll take bias tape, store-bought or handmade, and you will just cover the seams. And so on here I use a zigzag stitch because I struggled with straight stitching at the time, but you would straight stitch it or zigzag it, and this will cover the raw edges, and then you will have clean seams that won't unravel.